Hola. Uy.
Hello. Good afternoon. With so many people and with this wonderful music, one feels like dancing instead of speaking. But anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for coming here today, considering how wonderful the weather is outside. Welcome to our guests. I must confess that I'm very happy to be here together with you today, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to have a chat. This panel is entitled Father, Country and Patriarchy, and we're going to be talking about several concepts. One of them is patriarchy, as the author, the patriarch, and country or nation as the nation of the father. So I've always felt that there's a response in your books to this issue of a symbolic father that goes beyond that literal meaning of the word. And if your books, I think that what we can find alternatives to the normal paths that we follow. Or perhaps these are warnings, which is, well, something to be taken into account. And sometimes we see some literary criticism about this new normality, and also in relation to those shortcuts that apparently liberate you, but many times they just fool you. And this makes us think twice about what we have. We have to look beyond the mirage, beyond the trompe-l'œil. And this has been described to overcome dissidences and disagreements in terms of paternity, motherhood, vulnerability, activism, and well, concepts like this that are pretty significant, that are mystified and are sweetened, so therefore they are also hidden. In your literature, I think that these are things that can be seen. ELAINE, there are writers that lift the tablecloth so that you can see what is normally not seen. And I think that you are lifting these tablecloths, all three of you. So an expert at revealing these things and using words as if they were knives is CRISTINA Morales, sitting on my left. No, sorry, on my right. I'm sorry, I can't tell the difference between right and left because I'm very nervous, but everybody's sitting to my right. Well, the first to my right. She was born in Granada. She has a degree in law and political science. She has written books like, or novels like Lectura Fácil, with which you won the Radler Award in 2018 and the National Narrative Award in 2019. And we also have Últimas Tardes con Teresa de Jesús and Los Combatientes. Okay? Oh, here we are. You can see me on screen. That has been published by Anagrama. You are also a dancer and a choreographer at the School of Contemporary Choreography and the executive producer of a band called Bunt Atasco. And you've also published La Tiranía de las Moscas. So just please remember the covers. And let's move on to our next speaker. She was born in Havana, and she has a degree in theatrical art, and she's a professor of creative writing. Your texts have been published in different anthologies, and you've won diverse prizes. In your most recent novel, The Tyranny of Flies, has received the Calama Award for the best book of 2021.
De literatura infantil. Destaco Janis Joplin, publicada por Susa, premio Eunda Mike Academia y traducido al castellano por Consoni en 2020. El ensayo...
And this, so therefore she won the Euskadi Award.
19 y traducido al castellano por Reykjavik Ediciones.
And lastly, we have the Nastecoa Literary Chronic, Chronicle and published by Susa in 2020 that has just been translated into Spanish. I'm sorry, but I've got a big mess here. That is called La Trastienda por Consoni. And you can find, by the way, you can find it at the festival, even before you find it in many of the bookstores. And all of these writers have tried to do their best to fight against the transport strike so that the books could make it here. And this is, well, just a reminder before we start, well, before buying the books at enormous digital platforms, I would like to encourage you to buy them here at the festival and whenever it's possible to do so at fairs or at your favorite library. The authors will later on be signing their books here. Okay, well, without further ado then, I've clocked this for 5 minutes. I'm not sure if I've finished in 5 minutes, but I only hope so. So if you want, let's start off with who the protagonists of your books. And these characters that we could say are strange or marginal or different, and which could be nice or the opposite, and perhaps even unpleasant sometimes, but I think that they're always fantastic and admirable, and which fight against that father, that symbolic father. In ELAINE, you work on your homeland and your family in an analogous manner. You present a tyrant who's a stutterer who lives in a house, and in a family is a nation. And, well, his wife, Cassandra, and the son, Cacalia, and the intelligent flies form part of his novel. And UXUE, what you usually say is that Father, Patriarchy, and Homeland are the mirrors in which we look at ourselves. And you're talking about the political and social story based on embroideries and on the library that is owned by two sisters. Lecturas Fáciles y Últimas Tardes con Santa Teresa de Jesús are really cathartic artifacts. And so are the actors and actresses that are involved in the play. And here we have criticisms and self-criticisms of those places you come from. This refers to CRISTINA. So perhaps you could describe how the characters of your novels, how they deal with normality as a device for social control. This is something I've taken for an interview with you. This is an interview with you, ELAINE, and the political father is from your work, UXUE. So if you want, we can kick off with you, ELAINE, with this idea of how your characters deal with this double morale. Well, a country is also a margin. It's like a bubble, too. So first, I'm talking about Cuba. So that's why my writing has characters that are marginal, that are people who live on the very limits, that are people that are putting themselves to the test, to the trial. And we have to look at ourselves in this distorted mirror, but it's sometimes very clear, and that is literature for all of us. And of course, literature, or at least this novel, La Tiranía de las Moscas, wants to look at itself in this distorted mirror and to analyze the figure of the homeland and the father and the patriarchy, which are synonymous of the same thing, which is none other than the oppression mechanisms that we've had to put up with during our entire life, and which have oppressed us as individuals, as a people, as ideas, and as bodies, especially these individual dictatorships that started off when the collective dictatorship came to a close, but not only then, but also when the doors of the collective dictatorships closed and the father of a homeland could become the father of a home and still remains a dictator. And I've always been worried about looking into small things in the literature, and paraphrasing a title of Arundhati Roy, looking at the God of small things. And these are the small things when we are indoors, and when all the medals are no longer important, at least in their appearance, and when it's the dictator, when the father of the homeland becomes the stuttering father or the grandfather, or in somebody's husband or somebody's father. And how these bodies that are oppressed within the house become a manifestation of the bodies oppressed in a larger space. And I've always been obsessed about these characters and how these characters, how they put across an idea or how they put across an interpretation of bodies seen from an incident. I'm interested in writing about those things, about these incidents. Limits to dissidence. Well, in a way, let's say that this is something that makes me think that perhaps here that's where the characters of your novels are present, aren't they, Cristina? Well, after listening to you, Maria, talking about Father, Patriarchy, and Homeland, what I have noticed is, above all, what I wanted to portray was a fundamental aspect that is essential for the patriarchy, and that is patriarchy as a skirt, as the Bolivian philosopher Maria Galindo describes it, to refer to that transformation of oppressions that have classically been exerted by the masculine subjects of power. And this is transformed into, well, to understand this clearly, we can call institutional feminism, in other words, the feminism of equality. So in Lectura Fácil, well, for me, it was very important that in terms of sex and gender, the villains were to be female villains, which was a very important thing. In other words, forget about the struggle between the sexes, that the man is from Mars and the woman is from Venus, which contains another big lie, which is the big lie of sexual binarism or generic sex. So in this manner, so by setting aside that Marxist approach that is applied to sex and gender, you can open up a marvelous world, a marvelous opportunity for self-criticism, as you've just pointed out, in order to be able to examine ourselves first, or myself, as a potential feminist subject, and that is me and my peers, me and my colleagues in the assembly, especially my female colleagues. So if you want, you can identify yourself with that feminine, with that gender. And I hope that I've managed to do so. I hope that I've upset that limiting binarism, and I hope that I've lifted the skirts of patriarchy, well, apart from the tablecloth. Well, yes, at the beginning I was talking about this father that has neither gender nor descendants nor anything literal, but is symbolic. But in this particular regard, and as political and cultural father, well, you talk a lot about, UXUE in particular, you talk a lot about Janis Joplin and about Nagore Vargas. But on many occasions, I think that in the back office, so to speak, or between the wings, there's an approach with regard to this norm or this normality in terms of social control, as you pointed out. So what do you think about that, UXUE? Well, good afternoon. Well, as regards this issue of father, patriarchy, and homeland, well, I'm translated it into the Basque language, and I think that as far as the homeland is concerned, it is not that easy to relate it to the father figure, because of the root Aba means father or uncle. Well, what I'm referring to is to the origin of the word, or to the meaning of the word. A fruitful father, that is what Abba could mean. And in relation to the title, what I did was start off thinking if we, or if this homeland that we call Euskal Herria, how did we call it historically? Because we used the masculine gender, or did we use the feminine gender? And we have used both genders in our poems, in our songs. So we've spoken about the home of the father, as Gabriela Aresti pointed out, or we have Daniel Lendar, I have no father, as Robbie sung. It's curious because it says in the chorus, it says, I have no father and my mother died. However, each of the children use one of them as a reference. When you have a father, the mother will live, and so will the descendants, in the freedom of the new people. And in other words, society without any levels, the father is the state. And let's say that the mother would be the language, and the language is always related to the mother. However, your homeland or your land is normally related to the mother. And the power structure of the people is connected to the father on many occasions. And many times, well, you were asking me about this concept of parents, but it's true that when I presented the Jane Joplin novel, I used a mention that was made of Joseba Llorrenindia, who said that in the Basque Country there are many daughters that are debating things with our fathers, and that's where I wanted to present both concepts, the concept of loyalty, which I think that we have many times been loyal to our father, and that on the other hand, within the scope of this loyalty, there's always been a conflict. And I think that in the case of Nagore Vargas, we have this ambivalence, and that affects towards our fathers are ambivalent too, because the father feels that, well, you feel that you emerge into life through your father, but it's the father that takes you practically all the way to death, and that's where we have violence and lethality. And this is something that I've seen in my own experience. So I think that in Nagore Vargas, it doesn't see her biological and symbolic mother, but if we resort to the other example, the rules of the game, what they do is redefine the daughters, and this is where the conflict arises, and that is that the daughters speak as sisters to speak up to or speak against that father, but they're still looking up to the father, although they also want to set him aside. But their gaze changes completely. And, well, they are, let's say, liberated in their ties with the father. And they describe the reality in a completely different manner. This is what I've seen in my most recent work, for instance. Well, the next thing that I had prepared for you was based on focusing on the idea that you know that this edition of this festival is focused on the issue of translation. So before, when we were talking about the questions, the idea was to talk about translations from the etymological perspective as an idea of moving from one place to another or from one riverbank to another. And in this, in the scope of this concept, this is a way of understanding translation in a much more expansive manner. And this was also something that is present in your literature, because I was pointing out to you, Cristina, that I was focusing, in your case, I was focusing a lot on having heard you talk about anti-rhetoric. And in any way, what I understood is that perhaps this exercise or this focus on anti-rhetoric perhaps could have to do, and this is why I wanted to ask you this question, perhaps it could have to do with an attempt at using it as a political tool to transfer reality in the truest possible manner. Well, that is a very, very difficult question. it's extremely difficult. Well, I can make up another one if you want. No, it's all right. It's all right for it to be difficult. There's no problem. Well, I use this idea of anti-rhetoric. I heard Saint Therese mention it for the first time, and she was against the rhetoric of her time. She was against the Dominicans, for instance, the Dominican fathers, and obviously Teresa couldn't go to the seminary and she couldn't go to the university, and well, she learned to read and write on her own or through somebody's help, but not at school or not at universities. And Teresa wrote against these people because they could not only read and write, but rather they used their reading and writing skills to avoid the biggest conflict of that time as to whether the Bible was to be translated or not into Romance languages, and therefore you needed to speak Latin. And when she declared herself against rhetoric, what she was trying to defend, well, firstly, she wanted the Bible to be translated into Romance, into Spanish too, and secondly, the Bani language, and second, she wants the church to speak up very clearly by using a language that is understood by everybody. So does this mean, so this anti-rhetoric of Teresa, or in the literature that she produces, is it far away from whatever is canonical because she doesn't have any access to canonical power? Well, in the texts that she produces can only be anti-rhetoric. In her calligraphy, you can see that she doesn't write like the Dominican fathers do or the theologians, but she has a very strange kind of handwriting because she was self-taught, or her mother taught her. So this anti-rhetoric issue means that you're closer to reality. Does that mean that you want to be truer? I'm not sure. Perhaps what Teresa is saying, what she's saying, is that her struggle against her rhetoric, what she intends to do is the opposite. In other words, that there be a new kind of imagination. And even more so, if we think about Teresa, this interpretation wouldn't be difficult to understand, because she was the person that said that an angel penetrated her with a fire dart, and that happened. And when I say that God kisses me with his mouth, that is not a metaphor. It is the fact that he kisses me with his mouth. Well, I'm a bit on the paranoid side because I don't know what metaphor means. It's not clear in my mind. What is it we were referring to when we say metaphor? Are metaphors rhetoric, or do metaphors allow us to understand reality better? Because this is a generation that created a fantastic image, which does it really allow us to focus on reality well? Well, a metaphor would form part of rhetoric. However, metaphors can bring us closer to reality. And when Sartre says in La Nausea, I'm looking at the palm of my hand, and I feel sick, and I feel like being sick. Is this a metaphoric figure of the anguish we're feeling? Am I interested in reading it literally? In other words, the nightmare is contained within the palm of your hand, and it couldn't be better put than that. Well, yes, I think that it's difficult to set aside this rhetoric that you just mentioned, because I think that it's complicated. for us to stand beyond those laws. In other words, the artifice of writing, but also of orality. But perhaps referring to other figurations, and that is the translation we're talking about, there's another notion in which I'm interested in, this concept of transferring ideas that I mentioned to you before, ELAINE. And it was all about, well, reading. When I read your book, there were many times when I thought that you were talking about that permanent summer. Well, in that novel you talk about a permanent summer in which the plot unfolds and which you write about. And this is a completely different territory compared to what is published. Because what I believe is that many of the issues that are mentioned in the book, this tyranny and this domestic dictator that you spoke to us about before, and the mother that does not love, well, this constant buzzing of the flies, this is something that is present in these places. And now that you've had the opportunity of spending some time with the Barret people presenting the book since you received the Galamo Award, how do you think that this is happening? How do you think that you're transferring what you're writing about until it's published? And well, I had a friend who said that when she wrote something, she wrote for somebody, and that's what Cristina Lagarza says. You can't write for an extensive audience, but rather you always have to write for somebody. And in that somebody, I said, well, if a Swede person is going to read me, I become obsessed. And in this book, I was considering that too. So were you thinking about who was going to read this book here? Or is it something that you've gradually received? And I was also wondering if you've come across any kind of very specific reaction, and when people say, oh, all of these issues of domestic tyranny have nothing to do with this. This only happens in Cuba, or has that not happened? And I was interested in that. I know I've asked you lots of things. Well, there are several things there, and what you've just asked about. When you write and when one dares initiate this journey, you know that there's a reader. Sometimes it's an ideal reader, and sometimes it's an imaginary reader. But I can't really think about individual readers. It would be like trying to satisfy thousands of ideas, or at least reflect what other people want to hear. So that, what I always say is I'm just going to feel happy by writing literature as if it were a performance, as if it were a theatre, a theatrical performance, because we all live in our small ritual spaces and our performative spaces. And that's what the novel is all about. It's a performative space that is closely related to the reality that we've all experienced in the last 2 years since the pandemic reached our lives. And this is a novel that also talks about politics as if it were a pandemic and as if it were a closed space, agoraphobic space, and the destruction of each and every one of us, of these internal microspaces of each one of us, which is another of the rituals of the pandemic. I wrote this when I was locked down in Cuba, when it was impossible to get out of the house. And I was thinking that, well, all readers were going to be equally confined. Everybody was paranoid, everybody was feeling completely devastated. And I think that it's a novel that people say it's utopian. And now it's a great pleasure to be sitting here next to the publisher of the novel. No, she doesn't like that label of publisher. No. No, I'm mentioned as the publisher, but it's definitely not what I wanted to do. And I don't want to do anything like what a publisher does. No way. I'm happy to be on the front cover, and but nobody, please don't think that I was her publisher. Well, I think that you're like a godmother, really. Yeah, that would be much better. It's a much more sisterly kind of relationship and much more comfortable. Yeah. we co-breed this book, as it were. And then CRISTINA, the godmother of this book, said it very clearly in the prologue. He said it's very easy to imagine that a book is influenced by the space where this book has been created by its author. And we all have our own fabulation. Everybody has their own version on Cuba. And even those of us that live in Cuba or left Cuba, it would be very reductionist to imagine that this space corresponds with Cuba. It would be like looking at ourselves in the mirror and say, look, this has nothing to do with me. And this, what is mentioned in this book, it only happened in Latin America or in some third world country. So that means that we are colonizing our writing process, but we are not doing that as the subjects of a process. And what I always say is that let's see how my novel, let's see how it can be applied to these spaces of political and family and personal collective oppression of each and every one of us. So let's not only apply the rules to the third world or to those spaces that we think are very far away from our reality, because what it is true is that we all live very specific forms of tyrannies. Well, with that wonderful closure there on all the tyrannies we live, and I wanted to talk about your work, but anyway, or perhaps in the next session if there's time. Well, now just to continue with what it is we were just discussing, there's another notion too in relation to translations that has to do with this issue that we're talking about transferring contents or ideas. We were talking about rhetoric itself. And there's something else that has to do with a more literal notion of translating something, which in your case, UXUE, is something similar happens to you. This is what we spoke to ELAINE about, because you're moving in a specific territory, and I'm referring to translations into Spanish. This is published first in Basque, but just to focus on this more literal concept of a translation, when this is published in Spanish, that transfer takes place into another language. It is not only another language, but it's also going to be a minority. You transfer this from a minority language to a hegemonic language. And I think that it's interesting. This is a very interesting exercise. So how the characters in the book or how the writing is affected and how the book is received too, because it's not the same thing of how this is perceived in Basque. We've already mentioned this in the past, compared to how it's perceived outside the Basque region once it has been translated into Spanish. Well, yes, translating from a minority language into a hegemonic language is, well, when you can actually notice this imbalance between languages. And for me, it's equally important to see how the linguistic situation of the Basque people is represented and how this can be translated. And there's something that Miriam Amuriz has said several times, which has to do with linguistic orientation. And orientation that can be understood in four different manners. In other words, how we stand in relation to something else. In other words, what is taken as natural orientation could also be a path. It could be an intuition that tells us the path that we have to follow to not get lost. And orientation could also be related to desire or to sexual orientation. But orientation could also be the expression of a desire, of an impulse, something conscious. In other words, the way one decides to live. And, well, that's, when I write that in Basque, that's all present, but when the work is translated into Spanish, a number of things happen, curious things. For instance, we're talking about the narrators don't speak Basque well in the back room. There are lots of books in which the narrators speak very badly because of a number of reasons, obviously related to social class and their origin. And in this case, well, it's all about reflecting this disclosure situation, in this case between Basque and Spanish. Well, there's a coexistence in this territory, and there's an anormalization of the Basque language too. And what we see in the book is a consequence of that. Debologeta is what they say in Basque, and this is a term that they make up. They are the owners of a bookstore, and they say devolucoteca when the books are taken back. They have no respect for the rules that apply to word composition. But if I were to interview them in Spanish, they'd say devolución because they are familiar with the term. But what happens when you translate into Spanish? Well, these narrators, in Spanish, they would speak correctly. And it would seem, therefore, that they speak Basque incorrectly. But I'm interested in seeing what happens in our minds when this goes through the translation process, and then we have the issue of double fiction. For instance, in the Janis Joplin book, I think that happens to all of us that write in the Basque language. When you write in Basque, what you do is translate reality constantly, because we are experiencing lots of realities and lots of scenes that don't happen in the Basque language in our territory. Because normally, in our territory, the police and the administration and judges, they speak Spanish. And there are many neighborhoods where people speak Spanish. But these are situations that we put across in Basque in the book. So we're generating something there. So if literature is an emulation of reality, and if it's an artifice, what do? It's a linguistic artifice. And we add a little bit more onto that artifice. So the Basque reader knows that Rafa Vargas, the father, doesn't speak Basque. It says so in the novel, but they read it in Basque in the novel, and through that pact, through that agreement, they believe these dialogues between the two characters. But what about the translation? Well, this is translated, and the conversation of these dialogues seem to be very natural, two people speaking in Basque in the kitchen. So what happens is that sometimes the translation sounds like the original, and the original sounds like a translation, and that's dramatic. So therefore, what you have to do, you have to write, you have to be very sharp, so to speak, so that our writing can overcome those two obstacles, and for things to work out, and for everything to look and sound natural. And the same thing applies with our filmmaking or with our audiovisual production. You know that you have to overcome certain obstacles that are going to add more difficulties, and we have more limitations than in the case of hegemonic languages, of course. Well, yeah, I think that, yes, when we write, we're thinking about the translation, unless you are monolingual, because you don't only think in one language. You know that languages coexist and they co-function in our minds. And when I write in Basque, sometimes I think in Spanish, but I'm writing in Basque. And perhaps somebody that speaks English, when they write a novel in Spanish, has thoughts in English, and they have to find an equivalent. For instance, when I wrote a story once upon a time, I remember that one of the characters, one of the main characters, said about a woman, "Oh, what a lovely bird." And that's what I had in my mind. But how can you put that in Spanish? What a lovely bird. Well, and how can you actually develop that phrase or translate it? Well, I found a solution for that, and I thought, okay, well, something that somebody from Mundaka said, or Bermeo, I don't know where exactly, but his parents were elegant in church, and one day the father didn't want to go. And I said, oh yeah, really? And when the wife was about to leave the flat, the husband says, "Well, you are looking very flashy." Well, it's difficult to translate, or what a look you have, because he refused to go to church. So living in this context, it could be a difficulty, but of course, this is something that also poses different linguistic logics and structures that could allow us to establish this credibility, and that's why we have to take into account a number of elements, of course. Well, we have a few minutes left, and the elements we're discussing here to be taken into account in a translation in a literal manner. This is something that UXUE was just pointing out on this a more expansive translation that we were just talking about. Well, we could perhaps refer now to the translation of linguistic languages or linguistic forms. As you've spoken about additions, if you don't know, just in case you didn't know, barret, well, I will let you know even if you do know. But what I was going to say is that Barret, the publisher, has a wonderful initiative which consists in inviting writers, authors, well, until now, it was Patricio, no, not Patricio, yes, Patricio Bron and Sara Mesa, and Sabino Aurraca, and Cristina Linares, I think. So inviting writers that they say they admire so that they can propose a text that has never been published before from a writer that is more unknown. And this is the idea. And this is where Panza de Burra came from by Andrea Abreu, with Sabino Urranca as the publisher. So as regards this idea of other kinds of works or other kinds of translations, it is true, and I was going to put this question to you, and well, now that somebody's mentioned this, but I want to ask you, what was that edition work like? I suppose that you wanted to avoid that term edition after seeing that in the introduction you spoke a lot about this, and I can understand what you're referring to, but you referred to editorial violence. So I'd like to know what your work has been like, or what it was like since Barret invited you. So how does this support work, this element that you pointed out before? It's very easy, very straightforward. Well, Barret suggested that I propose a text, an author, and I then asked ELAINE, and I said, ELAINE, have you got anything? Have you got anything that's sort of half done? Said, no, and I don't think that I'm going to have anything done. But, well, when you have it, just send it to me, and copy with a copy to the editor, and then we'll read it. And then we'll make our comments, and you can accept or disregard those comments. And ELAINE and myself, well, I gave her all of these instructions, and she finished her novels, but she sent me a draft. It was half of it, or 1/3 of it, I can't remember now. But I waited for it to be finished, because I believe that it's a very big interference and a lack of respect if you're going to say something to an author when it hasn't been finished, because that could have a very big influence on you. No, you have to allow the work to unfold. You have to forge ahead with the work until you finish. You have to put your blinkers on and finish. And when the complete novel arrived, I read through the document and I made some comments. And I forgot about the spelling mistakes and all those things. No, I said that will be done by somebody doing the spell check, so we don't have to bother with that, neither ELAINE nor myself. Garcia Marquez used to deliver his draft documents, and they were horrible. And he didn't even know how to put in any accents or anything. So if Garcia Marquez did that, why can't we do it too? So, and I did make some suggestions regarding contents to ELAINE. In other words, where I felt that I was getting lost, and I said, look, ELAINE, I don't know what you're referring to. So at some very, very specific moments, But otherwise, there were many stylistic things that I would never have been able to solve, and thematic perhaps, well, especially stylistic, that I wouldn't have solved as well as ELAINE, and I didn't even mention that, because this is ELAINE's novel, and that's it. And if I propose the text of a colleague, it's because I trust my colleague. And I definitely do not want to modify her style, her style, or her ideas. And that's how everything came to an end. Well, yes, I was entrapped by some of the comments that have been made on this issue of edition that I found attractive and I found fascinating as an editor. And they also made me think about what you were talking about, because what I understand is that we're talking about your own personal life within the covers, and then outside the public life has to do with distributors, bookstore owners, influencers, and she shouldn't be concerned about that, only about what happens within the covers. And then these within the covers should be the area of the specific area of what the author wants to do. And we know that, well, this is frequently attacked by what's going on outside the covers of a book. And it's something that I found very attractive. And I said to myself, well, these are things that we have to take into account. In other words, outside the covers, there was an issue in the case of Janis Joplin's book. I still remember the covers and the text outside. What is it you write on the outside, and what is it you consider? Do you consider it to be marketing, or do you consider it to be content? And well, we, for instance, we enjoyed reaching a consensus with you many times. Well, many times you have that doubt. In other words, where are the limits of the work to be done between editing and writing? And well, it says here, time's up. We've only got 10 minutes left. So here we're talking about the voice of the patriarchy without any gender or with skirts.
Por favor, pues que levante la mano. La pregunta.
And if anybody wants to ask any questions, please raise your hand. I understand that you can ask your questions in either English, Spanish, or Basque. I suppose so. That's what I assume, anyway. Is there anybody that wants to ask any questions? No? So it doesn't want anybody to ask any questions? Well, we can carry on talking if you want. And now it's the countdown. The countdown is starting, and that's very slippery. Let's see, 9:50, 9:58, 9:57. Okay, nobody wants to interrupt us. Everybody's laughing, but nobody's asking anything. Okay. Okay, well, we could carry on then with this issue of artistic languages beyond edition. I have two questions, because we can either talk about bodies or we can talk about this issue that concerns the different artistic languages. What is it you feel like addressing most? Why don't you suggest one? Artistic. Would you like to talk about the other professions? I don't know. Would you like to talk about improvisation in UXUE's case? So, what I'd imagined, well, you are writers that play with the gender frontiers, and you're focusing on many areas. I know that you are a dancer too, CRISTINA, and a choreographer, and you, ELAINE, have also been working as a teacher in plays. That on the one hand. And then on the other, there's also, as you can see in the introduction for Últimas Tardes con Santa Teresa de Jesús, has really affected me, because you say, CRISTINA, that writers also have a body, which we forget about completely. And it's with the body with which you write. And Nagores Vargas and UXUE, you spoke a lot about the importance of bodies in the book, and you, Elaine, also talk about the importance of bodies. Okay, so we talk about bodies, or what do you prefer? I'll let you choose, because we have 7 minutes, or we can talk about both subjects, or I think we don't have enough time to address both issues. Or do you want me to decide then? Well, then I feel uncomfortable because I'm the editor. Well, tough luck, that's why you're the moderator too. True. Okay, does anybody prefer, does anybody in the audience, does anybody prefer one question or the other? Bodies, okay then. Well, bodies, well there you are. So we've taken the decision in a different manner. Let's talk about bodies then. So this is, well, writers also have a body, and sometimes you forget about that, and it's with a body with which you write and nothing but. And in Nagore Vargas, the issue of the body is a place for pain, sex, violence. And then in the La Tirina de las Moscas, the body is also a protagonist, and the mechanism of repression of the father through the body, through punishment, through shouting, through violence, which is practically always physical. And Cassandra, the eldest daughter, also uses her body and those objects that she loves and decides as forms of dissidence. So I wanted to ask you about that body as translators, as a tool of violence, but also for possible dissidences or disagreements and on the job. In the protagonists of your work, or yourselves as writers. And now you have 6 minutes left only. Well, you can only write from the body, from my point of view. And you always have to write through the body. And for me, the experience that I'm living in, well, I have to write from a body that is not necessarily the heteronormative body, but rather you have to tend towards the margins, which has a close relationship with my culture and with the cultural roots in which I live, because I also am interested in dissident bodies, those that are fighting against somebody else's rule. In other words, bodies that are presenting a completely different point of view of what life could be like beyond those four walls we are encapsulated within, because you know that human beings always try to define everything, although sometimes our body doesn't reach out to everything. But I think that we always have to write based on the experience of a performative body, a body in motion, and a body that is undergoing changes. Well, when I said body, I meant dead body. I was talking about the death of Juan Marcé. So right now, I'm not very sure about what I said. But this is why, well, we know that the difference between mind and body is very Western, and it's very Platonic too. And I understand that we say body to understand each other, but because when we're talking about bodies, what we want to do is explain that way of feeling in our minds, and it's our minds where intelligence occurs in the Western world, at least historically, together with art and whatever requires or deserves esteem in our society. But I don't want to consider myself as a body, because I'm not a body. I'm much more than a body. Fortunately, of course, I have a close friend, a writer called Victor Balcells, who will soon publish a novel through Anagrama, and he says that he's in favor of recovering the concept of soul in literary criticism. In other words, of saying when a text does or does not have a soul, which for him is very evident, that is when a text does or does not have a soul. And this soul, of course, is the soul of the author. So we'd also have to say that authors do not only have, writers do not only have a soul, they also have a body, not a mind. You know that the mind is a very limiting and psychoanalytical concept. I think that writers have a soul. They might repress it or not, but they do have a soul. And you publishers also have a soul. Good, I'm feeling better now after that comment. I'll feel much better now after this. UXUE, would you like to say anything? Well, I don't know. Well, perhaps we could talk for a long time about this and look at this from many different angles. And the body is a very complex issue, and I enjoyed this concept of the soul too. And perhaps this has no connection with literature, but what I was thinking about right now is that when the father of my partner was dying, they were together, and at a given point in time, it seems that he wanted to urinate. That my partner was there, but he needed to go to the toilet. Said, "Look, if I go to the bathroom now and he dies, well." Anyway, that's what I was just thinking about, because I believe that this we could associate this these concepts of body, soul, living body, etc. And the body, I'm a person that has fought a lot with the lack of body from the point of view of improvisation, because what has been performed many times have been talking heads, and that's what we consider to be talking heads that have no soul and that have no body, as if what we were doing was just all about something that is dialectical. So we had to introduce the body concept to insert those power relationships. And as I say, well, we could talk about this for a very long time, and we could add many things to this discussion. We've got 57 seconds left. 52 seconds left.
51. 50.
So nobody wants to ask then. So there's not going to be somebody in the audience say, look, I'm going to ask a question now that we have 40 seconds left. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, there's one question over there. Really? Honestly? Is there one question? We've got 10 seconds for the question. What was that? Could you define the soul? Define the soul. Define what the soul is. Well, fortunately, this is a concept that has no definition, I'm afraid. And this is, well, perhaps my colleagues have to say something about this, but let's say that the Agustín García Calvo, that outstanding philosopher, he used to say that it's those things that cannot be defined those that preserve the most genuine spirit of whatever. And of course, well, we could mention Kant or Hegel. We could also mention Plato once again, and we could mention so many people to define the soul. St. Augustus, St. Thomas, St. Augustine, I mean, St. Thomas. But I think that the potency of the soul concept is that all of this auditorium could be more or less in agreement in relation to what it is we are referring to, and we all agree that it's very difficult to define it, and I agree with that, and I think that we publishers have a soul, and that makes me feel very happy too. So with that, and I feel very happy to see that there has been one question. Well, that didn't answer my question, really. I don't believe in the soul, you see. Okay, but I'm afraid that time's up, and we have to leave. We have to stop here. So there you are. Thank you very much.
Ha gustado.